Welcome back to the 49th Sri Lanka Surgical Congress annual academic sessions organized by the College of Surgeons of Sri Lanka jointly with the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh and the South Surgical Society. And we are coming up to the last symposium organized for today, that is the symposium number 10 on urology. And this symposium will be chaired by Dr. Namantha Nandasena, consultant urological surgeon attached to the North Colombo Teaching Hospital, Ragama, and Dr. Ranga Vikramarachchi attached to the Kothalabala Defence University Hospital. Over to you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last symposium of the day, Symposium on Urology, organized by the SLAUS. As SLAUS, we are very happy to be part of this program and share our expertise and knowledge with our surgical colleagues. Today's program, we have 45 minutes and 3 presentations. And for the next 45 minutes, we are going to have the presentations first, then the questions at the last. And we have a very expert panel to share our experience and knowledge in the field of urology. Now I would like to invite Dr. Manjula Vijayavardhana, the consultant urological surgeon from National Hospital of Sri Lanka. The topic is BPO and an overview. Over to Manjula.
Dr. Manjula, please unmute your button. Unmute the speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon. You are able to hear me now? Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Good afternoon. My topic for today is benign prostate obstruction. And as an introduction, you would note prostate is a 20-gram small muscular organ situated at the base of the bladder surrounding the prostatic urethra. For clinical purposes, it has 3 zones: peripheral zone, transition zone, and central zone. Today, we are interested about the transition zone because enlargement of this area gives rise to the prostate symptoms. Gradual enlargement of the transition zone by way of most of the prostate changes in the upper tract, including bladder and kidneys. There is a bit of overlapping terminology: BPE, BPH, BO, or BPO. You would note BPO significant obstruction caused by benign prostate enlargement. Now, this is very ambiguous and confusing. So, to unify this terminology, name, and that is LUTS, lower urinary tract symptoms. So, in place of BPH, BPO, BPE, or BOO, we could use LUTS. There are LUTS. So one should appreciate other urinary symptoms: polyuria, dysuria, hematuria, and so on, are not LUTS. One should also note LUTS is not always due to prostate. The classic example is females can have LUTS but have no prostate. This slide shows some of the other important reasons that can give rise to LUTS. And the diagnosis of this condition follows the general principle as any other, through history, examination, and some investigations. Now, in the history of a situation where most of the symptoms are very subjective and could change from patient to patient, clinician to clinician, symptoms have been devised to give some of objectivity. And the commonest used symptom score is International Prostate Symptom Score that examines 7 lower urinary tract symptoms and 1 quality of life questionnaire in order to severity, mild, moderate, or severe. Before the advent of the scores, there were voiding diaries where the patient recorded the urinary volume and number of visits to the toilet, if done properly, carries a lot of information. And for the uninitiated, there were visual scales. Patient could point out to his experience in the toilet on the diagram. And the quality of life questionnaires dealing with low urinary tract symptoms are very tedious. These are good for research. When you come to examination, it should be focused on the suprapubic area in order to rule out a palpable. These are good palpable bladder, features of the external genitalia, perineum, and lower limbs neurologically. Palpable painless bladder is a giveaway sign for. Okay, so I was talking about some of the investigations. Urine analysis and PSA are recommended. However, some centers would do a urine culture and renal function tests as well. Now, in the imaging investigations, ultrasound scan kidney ureter bladder is the investigation of choice. And the minimum data set for this test should include pre-void bladder volume, post-void bladder volume, prostate size, bladder wall thickness, intravesical prostate protrusion, and state of the kidneys. Uroflowmetry is the other basic test to assess the outlet. Now, little bit digression for this concept of intravesical prostatic protrusion. The analogy is drawn between a pitcher plant, which is trying to trap an insect, the prostate, the protruding part of the prostate into the bladder base. When the patient attempts to pass urine, curves and closes the internal urethral meatus. And this condition can be graded. And in most severe form of IPP, medical treatment is of very little value. These patients should be offered operations straight away. Now the big picture on the screen shows a normal uroflowmetry curve pattern, and that is inverted U shape. The other two flattened curves show outlet obstruction by two reasons. The investigations such as cystoscopy, pressure flow studies are not indicated for everybody, but they can be done in few selected patients. Now, when you have results from many parameters in the history, examination, and investigations, you need to put all together to arrive at the bigger picture before deciding on the treatment for the patient. Is there uniformity in the treatment of LUTS patients? Sadly, there is no uniformity, even among the urologists, let alone the surgeons and physicians. So there are some guidelines that gives uniformity to this treatment. Sri Lankan Association of Urological Surgeons endorses the European Urology Association guidelines for this purpose. And this slide summarizes the treatment modalities for low urinary tract symptoms. That could be watchful waiting for mild symptoms, medical treatment for the most patients, and surgical treatments, both minimally invasive and standard TURP, transurethral resection of the prostate, for very few patients. There are many new modalities that are coming up. They are trying to mimic the transurethral resection of the prostate, which is gold standard, and laser prostatectomy has now establishing itself very much. And in addition, laser prostatectomy can do an enucleation to mimic an open prostatectomy. Open prostatectomy as a standard operation also still has some place in our part of the world, and also to deal with very large prostates. Now, when you come to medical treatment, there are several drug classes which you can use. Alpha blockers are the commonest. Tamsulosin is an example. 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, finasteride or dutasteride, are useful when the prostate is bit enlarged, at least more than 40 grams. Bladder wall paralyzing agents or muscarinic receptor blockers such as oxybutynin, tolterodine, solifenacin are useful to reduce urinary frequency urgency. Nowadays, there is evidence that low dose PDE5 inhibitors, which are usually used for erectile dysfunction, such as tadalafil, helps relief of outlet obstruction. And of course, combination of all these 4 drug classes are now widely used for synergistic effect. Phytotherapy is popular in some parts of the world. Now, in the last 2 minutes of my presentation, I would like to mention some observation which is drawing an alarm among the urologists. That is, since there are some powerful medications for treatment of lower tract symptoms, physicians and nephrologists are gradually taking over the treatment of prostate symptoms. And this is quite okay. But the problem is some patients who would go on treating with medical therapy end up in bladder wall failure. And these patients, when they come for operation at the end, doesn't do fairly well. So the current indications for prostate operations are classically all the complications that could be urinary retention, recurrent urine infection, or life-threatening hematuria. Now, these are actually far advanced situations. In the ideal situation, patients should be selected before they reach these complications by assessing them while on medical treatment. So, intervening before it is too late will give rise to less post-operative complications. If you wait till the patient's natural history is very much advanced to operate, then the bladder wall is not functioning properly, surgical outcomes are poorer, and the reputation of the urology is at stake. Now, if you observe patients who came about 30 years ago for prostate operations, they were younger, fitter, with less medical conditions, and were in the early stage of the natural history of the disease. And they fared very well. After the operation, they could come off the catheter very well and need not have repeated surgical procedures, and they were happy for relief of symptoms. Nowadays, patients are advanced in age, carries a lot of comorbidities, and they are complicated. And in the end of the natural history of the prostate enlargement, and they fare very poorly after the operation. So this is all because the bladder wall is silently suffering due to tissue ischemia while the patient is happily swallowing the tablets. If you look at it histologically, evidence is now available. The detrusor undergoes irreversible changes while on treatment. So the muscle fibers vary in size and the numbers, and there is some abnormal matrix deposition among the muscle fibers. And this is now proven. So there are 3 stages of this adaptation in the detrusor. First stage is hypertrophy. In this situation, while the patient is asymptomatic, smooth muscle cells are hypertrophied and also hyperplasia, and there are a little bit of extracellular deposition of matrix. And when the situation progresses, patients become symptomatic and enters a compensation phase. Patient can still be on medical treatment during this time. However, the next stage is dangerous, and that is when the detrusor decompensates. At that time, the muscle response has all exhausted, and there is extracellular matrix deposition, converting nicely contracting, compliant, contractile bladder to just a physical structure like a bag of urine. So the burning question is, when would you abandon medical therapy and go for an operation? If you do it early, you would escape and the patient would be happy. If you wait till the last stages, patient will suffer. So there are no direct tests to know which one would advance. If you really want to do it, you have to do a cystoscopy and pick up some bladder muscle for histology to find this. And that is very invasive. Or you have to do advanced urodynamics. Now, certain surrogate markers have been detected that also can reliably give this information. And while the patient is on medical therapy, if you happen to do serial ultrasound scans, uroflowmetry, examination, you will be able to pick these patients up. So for example, if there is advancing prostate volume, worsening maximum flow rates, increasing residual volumes, and increasing bladder wall thickness while the patient is on treatment, that patient should be advised to abandon the medical treatment and come for an operation. Because if you wait till it's very late, even if you do the operation, patient will end up with more symptoms, residual, worse flow rates, and large residual volumes even after operation. And they are very likely to have a pre-operation. Now, stay-at-home messages from my presentation now. LUX is the new name for this combination of acronyms. Medical therapy is the mainstay in treatment today for prostate symptoms. However, early surgery, when indicated, is better than persisting with medication. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manjula Wijewardene, for that excellent presentation. And from Colombo now, we will move towards northern end of the country. Our speaker who's going to talk about ureteric trauma is none other than Dr. Balagopi, B. Balagopi, consultant neurological surgeon and senior lecturer attached to the Faculty of Medicine, University of Jaffna. Of course, Dr. Balagopi had an excellent academic career, both in undergraduate as well as postgraduate stream. And he has won many awards and medals, including the best performance in MD surgery. And his research interest mainly focused on the urological malignancies. Without further ado, may I kindly invite Dr. Balagopi to start the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson, sir. So I'm going to talk on ureteric trauma, mainly focusing on prevention and management. So we know that most of the ureteric traumas are caused by iatrogenic injury rather than external trauma. And the common surgery that causing iatrogenic injury is a gynecological surgery. The common site of injury is at the pelvic brim, where the infundibulopelvic ligament is attached. There are no specific signs and symptoms such as the ureteric injury, so we should have a high index of suspicion. If we look at the anatomy, the two important points we have to know: one, that the ureter across the iliac artery bifurcation is very helpful in identification, and that's a common site of damage as well. And the other important relationship is a uterine artery across the ureter, about 2 centimeters lateral to the cervix. The identification of the ureter using peristalsis and the feeling and the look is useful. So as I mentioned earlier, the iatrogenic cause is 80% for the ureteric trauma. The main surgery is a gynecological surgery, the high risk with the radical hysterectomy rather than the vaginal hysterectomy. Other surgical field like urology, especially for the impacted stone, and general surgery, AR and APR, and vascular surgery and orthopedic also can cause ureteric trauma. If you take the external trauma, only 1% of genitourinary traumas include the ureteric trauma. It's not common. It can be caused by blunt and penetrative trauma. The deceleration injury can cause separation of pelvic ureteric junction. It's not common, but it can happen with the kidneys with gross hydronephrosis. In this slide, you can see the external trauma mainly happens in the upper ureter, but iatrogenic trauma mainly occurs in the distal ureter. As the ureter is a retroperitoneal organ, most of the time, 75% of the time, ureteric trauma will be associated with other major injuries in the abdomen. There are risk factors for ureteric injury, especially if the patient have a dense adhesions due to the endometriosis or past surgery or pelvic inflammatory disease, or altered anatomy because of the mass effect of the tumors or fibroid, or due to the congenital malformation like ectopic ureter and duplex system. Having said that, most of the time, the ureteric trauma patient is associated with normal anatomy. The mechanisms, it range from crushing with the clamp or transection, kinging, ischemia due to the thermal injury. How we can prevent? Knowing the anatomy and anticipating the risk, especially if the patient have risk factors like dense adhesions and difficult surgery. I'm going to talk about pre-operative ureteric stent in the next slide. It is useful, it's a question. And secondary prevention, if you diagnose immediately, intraoperatively, and repair then and there, that's prevent the further complications. Of course, preoperative stenting facilitates the identification, but statistically, it's not affecting the rate of injury. But there are new stents that illuminate the light like uriglow is helpful in ureter identification, especially in laparoscopic surgery. So how we can make a clinical diagnosis? Need a high index of suspicion. The patient complain flank pain or rising serum creatinine after pelvic surgery, or we get a lot of clear drain, or if a patient passing clear fluid per vaginally, as the patient develop unexplained sepsis or paralytic ileus, we have to suspect clinically ureteric injury. Investigation, if it is diagnosed intraoperatively, visual inspection will be helpful. But if we suspect post-operatively, we have to do CT urogram with delayed image that will show the contrast exacerbation and sometimes will show the fistulas. CT urogram cross-section, we can see there's a ureterovaginal fistula with contrast pooling in the vagina. In the sagittal section, again, we can see a distal ureter injury with pooling of contrast in the vagina. Sometimes we do retrograde study if you have a doubtful images. Again, in this picture, you can see the right ureter is patent. This patient underwent laparoscopic abdominal hysterectomy, but the left side, there is a contrast exacerbation with the contrast entering into the vagina. So there is a ureterovaginal fistula. So this is a retrograde study. So management, it's depend on multiple factors. The main factor is the type of injury and the grade of injury. And other factors are timing of diagnosis and other patient factors. Timing of diagnosis, whether this is detected intraoperatively, then we will repair there, then and there. If it is diagnosed post-op, then the important question is whether it's the early diagnosis, whether it's diagnosed within 2 weeks, then we can do an immediate repair. The repair may be endourology, where we can do a JJ stenting, especially in the early grades of injury, or else if advanced grades, we have to go for open surgery. If it's detected after 2 weeks, it's better to delay the surgery up to 6 weeks, and some people say up to 3 months. But to prevent the nephron loss, we have to put a percutaneous nephrostomy. The patient have a hydronephrosis. In this picture, we can see a patient came with a delayed presentation after 2 weeks with a loin pain, rising creatinine. Patient had a hydronephrosis. Percutaneous nephrostomy was inserted, and antegrade study was done, and patient underwent delayed repair after 6 weeks. The AAST staging of ureteric injury, stage 1 is just a hematoma. Stage 2 and 3 is round section, circumference injury. 4 and 5, the segment loss. 4 is less than 2 centimeter devascularized segment. 5 is more than 2 centimeter. So this staging is helpful in management. Principles like anastomosis of any tubular structure, the bleeding ends, adequately mobilized, spatulated, stents, drains, and omental covers. What are the options available? As I said earlier, most of the injuries are the distal ureter. If it is a early grades, we can do a ureterostomy or suturing over the stent. Sometimes we have to go for a reimplantation. There's a bigger segment loss, then we may have to go for a Bowary flap. If the upper ureteric injury, again ureterostomy, if there's early grades of injury, sometimes we have to go for a transfer ureterostomy. Or if the whole segment is lost, then we may have to go do the ileal interposition. So end-to-end repair or ureterostomy, if the segment loss is less than 2 centimeter. Psoas hitch, we have to pull the bladder up and suture to the psoas minor tendon, or else the fascia over the psoas major tendon. Bowary flap, we make a flap and make a ureter. We can go up to sometime proximal ureter. This is a post-surgical picture, cystogram of a Bowary flap. And transfer ureterostomy, we had to do sometimes. And where the left ureter is brought over the inferior mesenteric artery. Ideal interposition is not a common surgery. And if the patient is detected early, if the grades are grade 1 or 2 or 3, we can put a JJ stent and escape. Sometimes it's very difficult to put the stent. Then if the patient have a nephrostomy, we can put the nephrostomy antegradely. Then we can pull the guide wire from down and put a stent. This procedure is known as Rendou's procedure, the French terminology. But this procedure have a high risk of stricture rate, about 50% chance. But this can be treated with balloon dilatation with a success rate of ranging around 14 to 89%. In conclusion, ureteric trauma commonly caused by iatrogenic injury need a high index of suspicion. CT urogram delayed images are helpful in diagnosis. We diagnose early, either intra or within 2 weeks, need an immediate repair. Delayed diagnosis, we had to decompress with the PCN or JJ stent, and we had to go for a delayed repair. Reconstruction is depending on the multiple factor. The main factor to decide is the grade at the site of injury. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Balagopi, for giving a very comprehensive coverage of the ureteric injuries, prevention and management. Now we move on to the next topic, percutaneous renal surgery technique and indications. Speaker is Professor Srinath Kansekara. She's the professor attached to the Department of Surgery, senior lecturer, Sri Jawaharlal University, and currently he has a lot of experience in PCNL. Over to Srinath.
Thank you, Namanta, and thank you, Rana. At the outset, I would like to congratulate President Dr. Jayenthra Fernando and his crack team for adapting to all challenging situations that the college has faced and for so successfully completing this entire Congress online. I think it has to be done. It had to be done in a matter of days to convert the traditional conference into an online. And well done, Mr. President and the team for the smooth conduct of this conference. Now to get to my topic, which I would like to finish in 10 minutes, I would like to talk about, although the topic says percutaneous renal surgery, I think this particularly refers to percutaneous nephrolithotomy or percutaneous removal of kidney stones, and it's the current trend of its techniques and indications. So let me start by giving you a sneak preview of the PCN, the technique of PCNL as it stood in the past, and how it is available to us at present. As you know, over 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when PCNL was initially introduced, and until about a decade ago, PCNL was just one operation, which is a standard procedure, which was performed in one position, which was the prone position, utilizing a large tract, often 28 to 30 French, using large telescopes. Fluoroscopy was the only localizing technique, with lithoplast being used almost exclusively for fragmentation of stones. The use of flexible instruments were minimum during this period, with suboptimal application of the knowledge of the intrarenal vascular anatomy of the kidney as to how it relates to the technique of PCNL. And indeed, nephrostomy tubes and drainage tubes were a necessary and almost 100% in usage during this period. However, at present, the scenario has changed completely, where PCNL is now a range of operations with multiple options using different instruments, different tract sizes, and different instruments. In different positions, it may be prone, supine, lateral, and various modifications. The tract size now has come down to as small as a blood needle, which is 8 French, and of course going up to 30 French, which is the traditional PCNL tract size. Similarly, fluoroscopy has been augmented or complemented with ultrasound, often being used in combination, which has improved localization techniques, and the addition of laser and ultrasound with a combination of these techniques now being used with modern technology allows lithotripsy or breaking of stones to be far more efficient than it used to be. Flexible instruments are frequently used during PCNL, both through the retrograde ureteric route as well as the antegrade route from the nephrostomy tracts. And the clear understanding of the relevance of intravascular and pericalyceal anatomy to the outcomes of PCNL has refined the technique to facilitate better results, and in particular, reduce hemorrhagic complications. So let me quickly take you through some of the key aspects of PCNL. As you know, PCNL is mostly utilized for the surgical removal of stones larger than 2 centimeters. However, when stones are very large and complex, the indications for PCNL has been traditionally to convert to open surgery. So when the stones are larger and much larger, running into complexities, there has been a tendency for this technique to be not to be utilized and for open surgery to be adopted. So I'm going to be talking about it in a moment. Similarly, smaller stones have been treated using various other means such as lithotripsy or ureteroscopy, and this has been when the density is acceptable. But when density is high, which is greater than 1,000 Hounsfield units measured on CT, or the anatomy is unfavorable due to complexity of the calyces or strictures or obstruction, and similarly with infections and impaction of stones, lithotripsy is not feasible, and in such instances, PCNL would be indicated even when the stone size is smaller. So let us revisit some of these indications and to see how they have expanded. And I would like to cite the seminal study, which included more than 5,000 patients from over 100 countries with more than 1 year follow-up, and the outcomes and the data that has been gathered through this global PCNL study has shed a light upon global practices as well as the outcomes following PCNL. So let us look at PCNL for large stones. As you know, that's a standard indication. However, very large stones are being treated by the open route even now in many centers. But when you look at the literature, some of which is cited here, you would see that large stones as well as complex stones can also be treated very safely and effectively with PCNL or percutaneous nephrolithotomy. So this is one change that has now been accepted, that complex stones too can be treated using PCNL. In this situation, prone position as opposed to other positions have been found to be more advantageous in achieving higher stone-free rates. Now, in this study that is cited in the slide here, the stone-free rate has been found to be significantly higher, almost 59%, as opposed to 48% in the supine position. So for large stones and much complex stones, PCNL is applicable or appropriate. However, the prone position may render or result in higher stone-free rates. There are numerous anatomical abnormalities which may result in the formation of stones and also make renal access more complex, of which horseshoe kidneys and maldescent or malrotation of kidneys are frequent findings. In the same study, one of the sub-studies where 202 out of 5,500 odd patients were found to have anomalous anatomy with stones, it was found that the technique of PCNL the outcomes following PCNL did not differ with other technologies with regards to complications as well as stone-free rates. And these included mostly horseshoe kidneys and other forms of anomalies. However, as expected, operating time in these instances have been significantly higher than with those without any anatomical anomalies. Again, the failed access, the incidence of failed access has been higher than with those without anomalies, ranging up to about 5%. So these are some of the differences that were observed. However, the conclusion has been that renal anomalies by themselves does not indicate that PCNL is not possible, and in most of these instances, percutaneous renal access followed by lithotripsy and stone retrieval is positive. In other words, PCNL is feasible. Now, before I get on to smaller stones and the utility of PCNL in removing these stones, let me address the current classification and the nomenclature that is used for different tract sizes and scope sizes in PCNL. The traditional scope has been larger than 25 French, and that's called the maxi, as you see in this slide. And the smaller size, 20 to 25 French scopes, have now been classified as MIDI, and those less than 20 French have been called mini PCNL. And if the scope and the tract size is less than 15 French, it's called ultra mini. And finally, the latest technique of a PCNL through an all-seeing needle, which is not thicker than a blood-giving needle, which is between 5 to 8 French, is called a micro PCNL. Now, this nomenclature has now come into acceptance since 2015, and Rosweiler classified the different tract sizes and the relevant nomenclature as you see in this slide. Now, whilst different tract sizes and scopes are available for PCNL, the relevance of that to the use of PCNL in retrieving or removing small stones is the incidence of bleeding. Once again, as you will see in this slide, the use of smaller scopes, less than 18 French, reduces the incidence of hemorrhage almost 5-fold. So therefore, small scopes, which are more relevant for the treatment of stones less than 1 centimeter, in other words, smaller stones, can be treated with mini PCNL with an acceptable morbidity profile, particularly bleeding, where the incidence is less than 5 times as compared to the standard PCNL. So therefore, the availability of small sized instruments and mini PCNL has rendered PCNL to be a very safe technique, and these small tracts are used most commonly for smaller stones, which is applicable in this scenario. There are other predictive factors for bleeding, which is operating time, stone complexity, body mass index, and the use of anticoagulants. So let us look at the treatment of smaller stones. As we are all aware, the standard treatment for small renal stones which are not amenable to medical expulsive therapy would be ESWL in the usual scenario. However, if the stones are very hard, that is in excess of 1,000 Hounsfield units, when the stones are lodged in lower poles or in calyceal diverticuli, if the stones are associated with infection, or when stones are impacted, whether it be a calyceal neck or the PUJ, ESWL becomes less effective in the treatment. In such situations, mini PCNL has been the preferred option. So very quickly, let me compare flexible ureteroscopy has been the preferred option. And in this slide, you would clearly see that mini PCNL has been found to be superior almost to all the measurable parameters, except the fact that there is a renal puncture involved. There is a one-off option for treatment. There is a lesser, if not non-existent, incidence of ureteric injury, higher stone-free rate, lesser expense, and significantly a shorter operating time. So therefore, with the advent of mini PCNL, the treatment of smaller renal stones has also been a practical and a feasible option using mini PCNL. So in conclusion, my friends and ladies and gentlemen, PCNL has now evolved into a versatile group of techniques using different technologies with multiple therapeutic options. The indications for PCNL have expanded to be a safe option for very large and complex stones. PCNL is also a safe and cost-effective option for smaller stones with specific indications. It is more cost-effective than flexible ureteroscopy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that informative lecture, the presentation. And it's time for the question and answers. We have already one question from Professor Aluvihare. That is to Dr. Manjula Wijewardena. Please re-emphasize the value of not delaying surgery to relieve prostatic obstruction.
Yes, that's a very valuable question. Thank you. So my point of view at the end of the presentation was that although the medical therapy is a very good method to keep the patients happy, it should not be tried on and on when the patient is not improving. But as the professor has questioned, I think in the Sri Lankan setting, when the patients have to buy these medications from out of pocket, for some patients, especially the village, for when they don't have any other pre-morbid conditions, it's best to do the prostate operation once and for all, rather than keeping them on medication and observe this deterioration. So I think what the professor wanted to know was, for an average Sri Lankan villager, straight away offering the operation, would that be beneficial? I would think it is so. But for other patients who can afford to be on medications, I think it's worthwhile to be on medication and see whether they deteriorate or improve and take it from there.
Thank you, Dr. Manjula. And there's another question from Professor Aluvihare, directed to Professor Srinath Chandrasekara. Should we not drink a lot of water so that the stone formation may be reduced? What is your opinion, sir?
Yes, I think increased water intake is known to correlate to lesser incidence of stone formation. I think it's more relevant to say that yes, in effect, drinking more water is important, but the dictum here is to say you should produce more than 1.5 to 2 liters of urine. That's more important. So there has to be adequate diuresis. So, for example, in hotter, arid climates, you may need to drink even more than in a more temperate climate.
Thank you. In the absence of any more questions, let us conclude the symposium. Let me thank all three speakers for their valuable contribution. Thank you so much. And this will conclude the 10th symposium and the last for the Sri Lanka Surgical Congress 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay with us, bear with us a few more minutes for the closing remarks. Thank you.